Hello everyone. I'm going to be doing a series of video tutorials since histology forms a great part of the lab in ANP2. We're going to begin today with the lymphatic system histology, and we're going to look at the spleen, lymph node, thymus, tonsil, and with tonsil I mean palatine tonsil, and the discrete lymphatic nodules that are found in certain organs. Let me start with the lymph node. Now when you look at the lymph node, what you notice is that it has a darker area, which is the cortex, and this could be stained dark blue as you see in the top picture, or it could be stained dark pink. Usually dark blue, purplish blue is the color that you see, but sometimes the stain may not take that well. But in any case, the cortex always stains darker and is peripherally located, and you see follicles and nodules present in the cortex, and these are aggregations of lymphocytes which form circles, or you might it may be a larger area, but all of this is concentrated in the cortical zone, which is why it stains dark. Then you see a lighter staining medulla, where instead of the lymphocytes being aggregated so closely, they kind of are dispersed, and in between those lymphocytes which are dispersed are seen as cords, so that's why we call them medullary cords. And in between those medullary cords you see empty spaces which are actually dilated lymphatic channels which are known as sinuses. So you notice that the cortex is darkly stained and the medulla is lighter stained. The reason it's darkly stained is because the lymphocytes are concentrated in the cortex, whereas in the medulla they are more discrete and just form thin cord-like structures. Now on examining the lymph node a little more in detail, if you look at the top picture, what you notice is that you can again see the cortex where you have these follicles, or what are known as nodules. You call it a follicle when you see that the lymphocytes are aggregated in little circles or balls. They don't have to be perfect circles, but you can see that they're concentrated in an area, and that's what we call a follicle. It's also known as a nodule. And in the center of each nodule, you may see a lighter staining area which is known as the germinal center. You don't necessarily have to see a germinal center. You see germinal centers only when there is some infection. And the reason you see the germinal center is lightly stained is because these have the cells, the stem cells, which are known as lymphoblasts, which have a lot more cytoplasm than a mature lymphocyte, and that takes up a light stain. So that's why the germinal center is always lightly stained. In the top picture, you also notice an area which is the capsule, where the arrow is pointing, and that is made of connective tissue because all lymph nodes have a capsule surrounding them. In the lower image, you see a very distinct medulla, and in the top too you see a medullary zone, though it's not as distinct as in the lower image because the lower image has been magnified. And what you notice in the medulla, and that is better seen in the bottom image, is you see these lymphocytes, instead of being aggregated as round follicles, instead they tend to form thin linear cords, and these are known as medullary cords, and it has been labeled MC. In between those medullary cords, you have those spaces which are known as medullary sinuses, and this is where lymph flows through, and as it's flowing through, it remains there because these are dilated. It remains there for some time so that the lymphocytes can react, and if there's an antigen that is recognized as foreign, they can take care of that antigen. And notice again that the cortex is so distinct from the medulla. See how dark the cortex is, where the medulla is lightly stained. Let's go on to see the next lymphatic tissue, which is the thymus. And much like a lymph node, the thymus too is divided into a cortex, which is darker staining, and a medulla, which is lighter staining. Now, in the thymus, what happens is, again, the thymus has a capsule, and the capsule sends in little connective tissue septae or trabeculae, which you can see, and this divides the entire thymus into smaller parts which are known as lobules. So all those arrows are pointing at little lobules. Now when you look at the cortex, unlike the lymph node, the cortex has no follicles and there are no germinal centers. So you don't have round balls in the cortex, and instead it is actually a continuous layer and there are no germinal centers. Now when you look at the medulla, you can see that it is definitely lighter stained, and in the medulla you will also notice light pink structures which are known as Hassel's corpuscles. Now let's move on to a more magnified picture of the thymus, where again you can see the cortex more clearly. It's labeled C in the top picture. In the lower picture you're not looking at the cortex. And you can see how the cortex on the top is a continuous band. There are no lymph follicles or discrete round structures. Instead it's a continuous band. Notice how there are no germinal centers. And when you look at the lighter staining medulla, in the lower image, look and see how it's not so concentrated, hence it's not that blue. And what's distinctive about the medulla is the presence of these structures which are pink in color and known as Hassel's corpuscles. The function of these Hassel's corpuscles is not known. It's thought that they're probably dying cells or what are called epithelioid cells. But if you look at these Hassel's corpuscles, they have a very typical onion peel appearance. So you should be able to diagnose the thymus from the lymph node by the presence of these Hassel's corpuscles, because remember, in the lymph node you have nothing like that. And then you can see that in the thymus, the cortex also is just one continuous band, unlike the lymph node where you have these discrete follicles. Let's look at the tonsil now. And here in the tonsil, you don't have a cortex or medulla. What you do have, however, is the epithelium. And since we are looking at the palatine tonsil, you will see that the epithelium is stratified squamous non-keratinized or wet epithelium. The top image of the epithelium is not that well seen, but in the lower image you can look at the epithelium, the multi-layered stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. And you can also see a crypt in the top picture, which is distinctive of the tonsil, especially the palatine tonsil. Now just under the epithelium, you are looking again at these round structures which are the lymph follicles. And if there is an infection, you will find a germinal center in the lymph follicle. And you can see in both these images, you see a lighter stained germinal center. So these are some of the distinguishing features of the palatine tonsil: the presence of epithelium, the presence of crypts, and the presence of lymph follicles, and usually they have a germinal center. Let's look at the spleen, and the first thing you notice with the spleen is it has a red and blue appearance. And this is very typical of the spleen. There is no cortex or medulla, but what you can see very distinctly is it has a very red and blue appearance. And again, like I mentioned, there is no cortex or medulla. And what you do see is that you see lymph follicles scattered all over, and they're just randomly scattered. And these are known as, instead of calling them follicles, we call them white pulp. But they are the same thing as follicles, but you don't call them follicles. Instead, you call them white pulp, and they are made up of aggregation of lymphocytes. Now, in the top picture, you can see it's a more panoramic view where you can see more of this white pulp. And in the lower picture, which is a more magnified view, notice how, again, you have these blue lymph follicles, and it's labeled WP. Now, surrounding this white pulp is the red pulp, which is red in color, and this consists of lymphocytes, macrophages, and free red blood cells, which is why you see that red appearance. And this is not present as an aggregation. Instead, it's just sort of surrounding the entire white pulp. Now, in the spleen, what you also see are certain trabeculae and septae, and unfortunately here you don't see such large septae or trabeculae, but if you looked at it in the lab, you do see very large septae and trabeculae, and these are pink in color and made of connective tissue, and you should not confuse these with Hassel's corpuscles. First of all, the spleen looks totally different from the thymus, so there should be no confusion. Let's now look at solitary lymph follicles, which are found in many organs. But what we are looking at in these two images are the Peyer's patches, which are seen in the small intestine. And you can see these are discrete lymphatic follicles, or also called nodules. And in the top image, you can see a very distinct germinal center. See how light staining it is, the center, whereas the periphery is darker staining. In the lower image, you're not able to make out this a germinal center. Now, how you identify this as the small intestine is because of the presence of these little projections which are known as villi. These are surface projections of the epithelium. Now, these solitary lymph follicles I've shown you in the small intestine, but you can find them anywhere. You can find them in the large intestine, in the lung. You might see them in any organ, and these are just because lymphocytes are present all over the body and they are meant to protect, or they're part of the immune system. Now that finishes this video, and the purpose of doing these videos, and you'll have a series of them for all the histology that you're required to do, is so that you get familiar with these images. I've only chosen certain images. I haven't included all the images from the websites that you're required to visit. You still have to look at all of them because any one of them can come in your quiz or test. But by looking at these images, you know what you're supposed to look at. And I would suggest that you look at these images fairly often. Make sure you revisit those websites and acquaint yourself with all the images there, and so that you don't make a mistake. And make sure you do these activities, and before a test, again, review these and those images from the website so you're thoroughly familiar with all the histological images, because those are the areas where students often falter. Now, having said that, I'd like all of you to have a great day. And let me know what you think of these videos and whether they help you learn histology better. Thank you.